All right, welcome everyone to today's installation of Civitas Day International, where we discuss faith, culture, and global affairs. We have today as our special guest, Manuel Mergal, architect, who is going to talk to us a little bit about traditional architecture. So welcome, Manuel.
Thank you, Eduardo. It's a pleasure to be here, and good day to everyone, near and far. So traditional architecture is a wide encompassing subject. And behind me, you can see that there's a number of images that talk about traditional architecture. And the first one right here behind me is a face and a capital, a Corinthian capital. And some people call traditional architecture or figurative architecture because it relates to the figure. And the reason it relates to the figure is because it relates to a standing person. And I'm going to quote a little bit liberally here from Vitruvius and paraphrase Vitruvius. So I may not be exactly quoting the right passage, but I believe on his second book in architecture, which was written way back about 20 centuries ago, he said that it reflects the person standing on the ground with his feet firmly planted on the ground and his head in the clouds, right? And that right there makes you stop and you say, wait a second. It's about agriculture and the heavens. It's about the relationship that exists between agriculture and what happens in the world. How do we as human beings control that? How do we harness the energy that is given to us by the sun and nature and make it work for us? Stonehenge, arguably, would be the first work of architecture because it's basically a clock, right? So bring it to the 20th century, which is more than 20 centuries after Stonehenge, a lot more. I don't know how many to be precise, but arguably it could be 40 or 60 centuries after Stonehenge. So architecture, traditional architecture has been around for a long time. And every culture, every climate deals with it on its own terms and in its own way. And for that matter, every architect deals with it differently. So our practice is based in New York City. And from there, we sometimes go to Palm Beach in Florida. We sometimes go to the east end of Long Island, the Hamptons. We do a lot in New York City, and we have work also in the Bahamas. So in every place that we work, the requirements are different. Not just from the client point of view, but also from the climate and context point of view. So no two buildings look the same. It's easier said than done, but that's the nature. But yes, do I have preferred architects? Yes. In some of the buildings that we're going to look at today, one of my heroes is actually Thomas Jefferson, who happened to be not only the third president of the United States, but he happened to be an architect, and a very good one at that, I might add. Contrary to what anybody else might say, he was a very good architect. Anyway, that's my intro.
Great. Well, so one of the things we decided to do for today's discussion is you're going to take us through some examples of traditional architecture from different cultures around the globe. So why don't we just jump right into that? It looks like the first one we've got on the docket for today is the Forbidden City in China. So I'm just going to share the screen here, and you can take us away.
Actually, if I could ask you to go to the map of the Forbidden City. One of the slides shows a map, because I think it is, yeah, there you go, that one, thank you. Therefore, it's important to understand always, as I just finished saying it 2 seconds ago, the context, right? And actually, to put us in an overall frame of mind, overall context, we're going to talk about 8 different buildings spanning roughly 5 centuries. So there's a lot, there's a lot to talk about in a short period of time. From the Forbidden City to a place in the Eastern Europe, Western Europe, Japan, India, the United States, Germany, and France. So it's a cross-cultural thing. Forbidden City was built, they started building it in 1406 and finished building it in 1420. And it's got some wild number of buildings. I believe from memory, it's about 900 buildings. You can count them right here. But the main point about this plan is that the 3 main buildings that you have there, the gate of, I'm sorry, the three main, after you go through the Gate of Supreme Harmony, the 3 main buildings are the Hall of Supreme Harmony, the Hall of Central Harmony, and the Hall of Preserved Harmony. And those 3 halls are in what is called the outer court. And the outer court is not the place where commoners could go. It's simply the place where the emperor would have his public functions and his, when he had to give a speech or an order, or he had to meet people, he would meet in the Hall of Supreme Harmony, usually. Okay, the Hall of Preserved Harmony in the back was where he would rehearse the ceremony. And the Hall of Central Harmony was where he would take a rest between commitments that were happening in the Hall of Supreme Harmony. Okay, so those are the 3 sort of public buildings that are in the outer court. The 3 private buildings where the emperor and his wife lived are behind in the inner court, and they're called the Palace of Heavenly Purity, the Hall of Celestial and Terrestrial Union, and the Palace of Earthly Tranquility. Okay? So those are the private quarters of the emperor and the empress. I believe the empress lived in the Palace of Earthly Tranquility, and the emperor lived in the Palace of Heavenly Purity. And the building in between them, the Hall of Celestial and Terrestrial Union, was actually like a storage building to serve both houses. So that's overall. Then all the buildings that you have in the inner court, to the right and to the left of the emperor's private quarters, those 3 buildings in the inner court. The rest of the buildings are houses of the nobility. So while the emperor's places of public display or private abode are divided in 3s, okay, the other buildings for the rest of the court are divided in 6 buildings. So you get 2 sets of 3. So you have 2 sets of 3 on one side, 2 sets of 3 on the other, and so on and so forth. So you count them, and eventually you end up with 900 buildings or so. Now, you want to go back to the first slide, please? So this is one of the gates, and I forget the name of this one in particular, but you can tell the main point about, I should say something, I should preamble the part of the reason why this is traditional architecture, as I was saying before, is because it reflects the person standing erect. Okay, so traditional buildings are made out of solid masonry and or wood, usually. They have columns, which are, representing people standing up. They have columns, and they have architraves, and they have roofs. Okay, so the load in any traditional building, whether it's in China, in France, in Eastern Europe, in the US, the loads are clearly transmitted from the top to the bottom. In this case, the roofs are supported by columns, and then the whole ensemble, the whole building is clearly grounded on a huge, what seems to be a foundation. It's really a wall, but visually it grounds the building. It makes it solidly attached to the ground. That is very traditional, very different from modern architecture, which tends to sometimes float, right? So you can go to the next slide. So the architecture can be very colorful, and all the colors have a particular meaning in Chinese architecture. The roofs are yellow, usually. These lights perhaps don't show the yellow very well, but the roofs are usually yellow, yellow glazed tile. Yellow is the color of the emperor. So emperor buildings have yellow tiles. No other building in China could have yellow tiles. Columns are red usually, and red is a symbol of happiness, life for Chinese. And the beams tend to have tend to be more colorful. They have green colors, black and blue, and some yellow. Blue is sometimes it refers to as the heavenly color. Black is referred to as the color of water. So what this architecture is doing is it's bringing together a number of natural elements, harnessing them, bringing them together into a building to tell a story. That's always the case of architecture. Architecture is always telling a story. Bronze, which was used for some of the sculptures, also has a particular meaning. You can go to the next slide, I believe. So you saw in the axial relationship of the buildings and in the way the buildings are composed, very symmetrically and very organized from the top to the bottom, solidly grounded on the earth. There's always the desire to display power. This is architecture about control, about the fact that the emperor is in control, that the emperor is the supreme organizing principle of Chinese life. You can go to the next slide. In fact, all the imperial buildings, if you look at the eaves in here, up on the top at the ridges of those roofs, you can see that they have little sculptures. So that also has a meaning, because the main building, which is I think the hall of the first one that I mentioned, what was the name of it? The hall of Supreme Harmony. That building has 10 of these little figurines. No other building has 10. The rest of the buildings have anywhere between 3 and 8. So there's always this hierarchical organization that is displayed in Chinese buildings. Okay, you can go to the next slide. The gold is the color of the emperor, so or yellow. So when you have these columns covered in gold, you know who's going to be sitting there, right there on the slide to your right. And the slide to your left, you can see the beautiful blue color of the beams spanning the columns. You can see the yellow of the roof beyond, and you can see how everything is sitting solidly on stone or masonry type of work. So the buildings were always made out of wood. The columns, as you can see on this slide on the right, the columns and the beams are you never use nails, because nails are violent intrusion. So you'd never do that. You always have mortise and tenon joints, which is also the way that they built in Japan, by the way. And any carpenter that considers himself or herself an artist would be very proud of this type of construction, actually, in mortise and tenon. And sometimes even today, we build windows with mortise and tenon connections as well. Though we cheat and we tend to put glue in between them to make sure that it's not going to go anywhere. Okay, you can go to the next slide. Right, so this gives you a flavor of what is happening. This particular building is the Palace of Earthly Tranquility. So this is where the Empress lived for a time. This was during the Ming Dynasty, mostly, because later in the Qing Dynasty, or Qing Dynasty, I'm not sure how you pronounce that, she moved to a side building. But for the most part, during the Ming Dynasty, she lived here. Okay, next. And this is the building in between the Palace of Heavenly Purity and the Palace of Earthly Tranquility. So you can see that this is a very different architecture because it's mostly a storage building. Now, the Forbidden City is not forbidden anymore. And that's a Western term, by the way. The real name of the original name of the Forbidden City was the Purple Forbidden City. So purple is because it's a royal city, and purple is a very, in China also, it was a very it was a very difficult color to get, and it symbolized royalty as well. In Europe, I think in the Middle East, it was also used to symbolize that. Symbolize very high status. In fact, there's a saying in China that says the purple air comes from the east. So it's interesting. But in any event, the point, you can go to the next slide, I believe. The point about all of these buildings is that in not only in their color, but in the figures, in the little statues that they have at the ridges of the roofs, in the ornateness of the building, mostly symbolized, I would say, in the colorful nature of the buildings. They are trying to stress the unity. The concept is the unity of humans, of man, and nature. Humans and nature, and the emperor being at the summit of all of that, of humans and nature. The emperor is the greatest thing. Okay.
One question for you there, Manuel, along those lines. I know you mentioned with Vitruvian man in the Roman and Western tradition. There's kind of that same element of man stands between the ground, the earth, and the heaven, right? Is there some sort of I don't know if Confucian or philosophical grounding in that in the way it's thought about in the Chinese tradition, or what are the kind of overlaps or differences?
I think, well, China obviously comes from a very different religious background, and they have Confucius was a big figure, and they have Buddhism. Somebody once explained the nature of some of the Eastern religions as opposed to the Western view of the Judeo-Christian Western view. They explain it like this, and it's kind of a funny story, but I think it gets the point. If you're in the West, if you're a Christian or a Jewish person, and you're attacked by a tiger, you run like hell. And if the tiger, you get to a point where you have to jump, right, down a mountain, you jump because the tiger is following you, and you jump, and then you grab onto a tree or whatever you find along the way as you jump, as you're coming down, and you grab on for life, because you do not want to become part of the tiger, and you do not want to become part of nature. You are separate from nature, clearly separate. So for Vitruvius, yes, the person is standing between heaven and ground, but the person is doing that for a purpose. Okay. In the Eastern religion, the person proceeded to explain, you're being chased by a lion or a tiger. Yes, you run. And you get to the edge of the mountain. Yes, you jump. But you realize as you're jumping down at the bottom of the mountain, there's another lion waiting for you with his jaws open, ready to eat you. And as you come down, you accept that. You have this accepting attitude because you know that you're going to be all eventually become part of the same nature. And as you come down, you see this on the side of the tree that you were supposed to grab onto dear life. Instead, you see an apple and you grab the apple and you eat it as you're coming down, and then the tiger eats you. So you become one with nature. So I think that's a very different. It's a funny story. It's meant to be funny. It's not meant to be too serious, but it does exemplify the difference between the Eastern way of looking at the relationship between man and nature and the Western way of looking at the relationship between man and nature. Does that make sense?
I think so.
Okay.
I am though, even if there's very different implications, I did think it was very interesting, the Vitruvian explanation you had, and then clearly here there's this idea of the palace of earthly tranquility and palace of heavenly, I forget what the noun was, but there is kind of very clearly this earth and heaven sense, which I've heard in the Chinese tradition often, this idea of the mandate of heaven to rule on earth is kind of part of the way the concept plays out.
In fact, in that plan that we were looking at, the orientation is north-south. That axis is north-south, and it's oriented perfectly towards the polar star, the North Star, which is where the mandate comes for the Chinese emperor to rule. So yeah, that is, and they believe that they get heavenly blessings. Okay, the color blue implies heavenly blessings as well. So there is this reverence for a higher being. They don't know who the higher being is. In their case, probably as high as they can think would be the emperor. But there is a sense of, okay, we are together under the emperor, and we get heavenly blessings if we live an orderly life like that. So it's always about order. This architecture is all very organized, and it's always about power. It's always about demonstrating great power that the emperor has. In fact, some of the, I'm not sure, go to the next slide and let's see if it shows some of the walls. Well, you can, I mean, yeah, this definitely symbolizes power. No, go back, I think. Oh yeah, this is, okay, yeah, no, go to the last one, the one that shows the moat. Yeah, so the Forbidden City is surrounded by a moat. So it's aloof, it's away from the hoi polloi, from everybody, right? And this corner here shows one of the guard towers. So the people, there is a separation, there is a distance that is always kept, so that the ruling class is always ruling. And I don't know if I have a slide showing the great walls that they have, but maybe the first one was the one that illustrated that. But if you've seen the movie The Last Emperor, you see him when he was a kid running his bicycle around all the streets of the Forbidden City. Because at that time, there was a transition happening, and the last emperor was able to remain living in the inner court of the Forbidden City only for a certain period of time, and then later he had to get out. But while the transition was happening, as he was a young kid, he was you see the take in the movie, following him along the streets, and the streets have these huge walls on both sides. So you feel when you're in those streets, you feel like you are somewhat insignificant in relation to the rest of the power and the structures and everything that is surrounding you. And that is done on purpose. That is done to show and to demonstrate power. This is what this architecture is.
And one question I have along those lines is, there's obviously a way in which that's portrayed here by the grandeur, and there can also be a way in which maybe certain kinds of modern architecture also portray a certain power in the sense of your smallness, maybe your insignificance. How would you define the difference between those two projections of power? Because I want to say with something like this, even as it promotes the sense of the emperor's power, there's something elegant about it that gives me as a nobody, as a common person, a certain life, right? There's a certain beauty here that I can take in and enriches me, even if I'm not powerful in terms of the emperor's status.
Yes, yes. Modern architecture did not start with the idea of power in mind. In fact, it started the opposite. It was as a result of the Industrial Revolution and later the desire of a number of, in Europe, there was I guess there were at the time, there was a lot of interest in socialism and communism and the common man and breaking down the barriers, not having kings and queens and the proletariat. So that's specifically communism. Not everybody felt that way, but a lot of people did, especially the university professors did. They wanted to make the architecture more accessible to everyone, more transparent, more free. So it didn't start, modern architecture did not start with this idea of domination, of power. Mussolini had that desire, and some of the work that he did expresses that Hitler had that desire, and that's why he hired Albert Speer as his architect, and they had these megalomaniac projects that have given a bad name to traditional architecture because they appropriated the classical language for that purpose. But alas, going back to Chinese architecture, the Chinese never had that problem. Nobody, I think, appropriated their language. The language tends to be, I think it's because the Western traditional architecture inherited from Rome and Greece perhaps is more tends to be more abstract, and this one is less abstract. This one is more direct, and these people, the Chinese people, truly tend to live this idea of feng shui and the meaning of the colors. It's real in their life, and I think because I don't know why, because we've lived with traditional architecture, with Greco-Roman architecture for so long. I think we have developed a relationship with it different than the Chinese. I'm not Chinese, so I'm not sure if I may be on shaky ground in here, but I think that in general, the Buddhist nature, whether it's Buddhism or Zen Buddhism or Confucianism, these people take what they believe in very seriously. I think perhaps more than we in the West do. But I'm on shaky ground when I say that because I have no basis for saying that. This is just pure speculation on my part.
So when I look at this, a few thoughts come to mind. The first is, there's something kind of that enchants you about the roof, right? The slope. You know, we've got roofs like this on our houses all the time. That, I guess, what is that called? The gable at the top, and it slopes down. But there's something here about the more circular curve, I suppose, that gives a very different feel. You know, what's that?
They, from what I read recently on that, they came upon that quite by accident. Now there is the pagoda shape, right? Which you immediately, when you look at this, you immediately think, oh, is this the beginning of a pagoda? If you keep going with these different tiers, you have two in here, but you could have in the towers that you saw at the corners, they have more than two, if I remember correctly, the picture. So you begin to have this pagoda roof, right? And you say, well, where is that from? Where did that come from? Well, it comes from India, actually, from the stupa. The stupa, which is a mortuary monument, tends to have several layers of stuff. And I don't know if in China it rains more than in India. Perhaps it does. I'm not sure. But they realize that when they have this I don't know, in shipbuilding, you would call it shear, that shape, right? When they have that shape, that the water doesn't come down with as much force, it sort of slows the water down, and then it trickles down, and then it trickles down. And somebody liked it, and they kept it. So that's the explanation that I heard, which to me makes some sense. And it has come to symbolize Chinese architecture more than so many other things, right? Because you immediately think of Chinese architecture with that. But interestingly enough, in Japan, in some of the shogun castles, they use similar shapes. So, and perhaps it's because they come from China. Some of the architecture in Japan, traditional architecture in Japan, comes from China. So it's a local tradition that as everything happens, it was started by somebody, and it took roots, and it stayed.
Very interesting. The one other feature that in this image, you know, just trying to react to it on a visceral level, the red, I have to admit, is very overwhelming to me. It's kind of too much, you know, and the yellow on the roof plays a little bit into this as well. But I need the green, the blue, and the black of what, remind me what those are called architecturally.
The beams.
The beams. I need the beams to kind of breathe a little bit from the kind of oppressive push of the red all along the bottom. I know you had said it stands for happiness, but I don't know if you have a sense of kind of what's in that concept, and what does the Chinese eye kind of see there?
Well, yeah, let's see. I have some notes about that here. The red is a symbol of good fortune also. So whereas for us, the red may symbolize blood, and it's a more serious color. For them, it's a symbol of good fortune and happiness. So it's just a different mentality, a different, and I believe that this slide makes the roof look almost orangey, but it seems that in reality, depending on how the light hits the roofs can be more yellow than what is shown on this slide. So that would also change your perception of this, I think.
So we've got a couple more here. I don't know if you want to comment on these, or if we should move on to our next.
We could move on to them. So these are minor buildings, and that's the pagoda-shaped tower at the corner there.
Would this have been some of the aristocratic dwellings you were mentioning?
These are the buildings actually on both sides of these little buildings. Actually, one of them, let's see, they're the Palace of Earthly Tranquility, and these little buildings are to each side of that palace. And they serve functions for the Empress And I believe in one of them, I'm not sure if it's the one on the right or the one on the left, the empress ended up moving to during the Qing or Qing dynasty. Uh, I don't know why she abandoned the Palace of Earthly Tranquility. Maybe it wasn't tranquil anymore. I'm not sure. Maybe they had too many kids and it wasn't tranquil. But anyway, okay. I think we can keep going.
All right, so we had as our next example here of traditional architecture, we're migrating westwards here to the Christian East. And we've got Voronet Orthodox Christian Monastery in Romania.
Right. And this has been called the Sistine Chapel of the East, because it's east of Rome, and for a good reason, as you can see in these walls. And this particular, well, let me step back. This was built in 1488. So whereas the Forbidden City was built from 1406 to 1420. So when that was happening in China, just a few years later, about 60 years later, not that much, this is being built in here. And some Gothic churches had been built in some parts of France by this time, or had been started by this time. And some architects that knew about Gothic architecture came here. I'm not sure why. Maybe they were escaping. Believe I read in one account that there was a war happening in Western Europe, and some of the people, the Masons, were escaping that, and they ended up here. And there was this. This is one of a number of churches in this area. They're called painted churches, I believe is the name that is given to them. Let me see, the painted churches of the north of Moldavia. So Moldavia and Romania are close to each other. And so this whole area of the north of Romania and Moldavia have a number of painted churches. And this one in particular is one of the most famous ones. In fact, the blue that you see here is known as, this intense blue is known as Voronet blue. It's different than the Chinese blue that we saw before, but it is, I think, equally intense depending on how, which picture you're looking at. And this church was built in 3 months, which I find astounding, absolutely astounding. I have no idea how. Well, I guess they don't have electricity, they didn't have plumbing, they didn't have to deal with codes, and they didn't have to deal with insulation. So maybe that's how they did it. They didn't have a building department like we have in New York City that is so difficult and arcane. So fine. Maybe that's how they did it. It was dedicated to St. George, and it was built by Stephen the Great. And apparently Stephen the Great came here to get advice from a hermit that lived in the area. I forget who the hermit was. And he won the battle. And so he came back in Thanksgiving, he built this church. There's a historian, a famous historian, whom I didn't know until recently, called George Bals, B-A-L-S. And he wrote in 1920, he wrote that these type of churches that you see in the north of Moldavia, they were Byzantine churches built by Gothic hands. Byzantine churches built by Gothic hands. And it does have a Byzantine shape. Let's see, can you move around the slides in fact, in this slide, go back for a second. In this slide, you can see that there is a Gothic above the entry door. To the left, there's a Gothic. You can see a Gothic window there, and to the right of this slide, you begin to see the round shape of the trefoil shape of the apse, and it's hard to see in this slide, but the left part was done at a later date. So originally that entrance and that Gothic window were not there. That wasn't there. And you can see, you can detect, if you look closely, that the left side, the frescoes on the left side and the frescoes on the right side of that wall are slightly different. The ones on the left side have more detail, they have more definition, they have more sumptuous clothing. No space is left unpainted in any way. Whereas the part on the right it is organized, but the clothing is not as sumptuous, and there's some free space here and there, and there's not as much detail, and the flora is not as prevalent as you have on the left side of this church, because that part was built later. The left part was built. They call it that part is called the exo-narthex. Exo-narthex. Exo, I think it means the exterior narthex for some reason. Anyway, you can go to the next slide, and that is part of that's the western front. This is where you typically would have an entrance into a church, because the east is where you usually have the altar, which is the same. You have that here. The east is where the altar is, but in this case, the entrance is on the sides of the western front. And in here, the western front, this became a final judgment, a scene of the final judgment. This may be the reason why this is called the Sistine Chapel of the East, because looking at this, it reminds you of the Michelangelo painting of the Sistine Chapel, of the Last Judgment that Michelangelo painted, and it is almost divided the same way, where you have the on one side and the people that are in heaven or that are supposed to go to heaven on the other side, and God is in the center. So it's very organized in that sense. Very beautiful.
I'm trying to see too. It looks like there's, for example, on the right, would that almost looks like it might be a Jonah and the whale on the bottom right. Is that what's going on there? Or am I?
That looks like that. Yes.
That's what it could be. And then is this on right above that? Is that looks like the angels are blowing the trumpets. Is that right? And the dead are coming out of their graves.
Right.
Yeah.
So notice there is this Gothic idea of the piers that are taking the thrust of the nave, of the walls of the nave, right? So these piers that you have in Gothic churches are there, but they are made part of the mass of the buildings, like you would have in a Byzantine church,
In a Gothic setting, is that would it be more the flying buttresses? Is that?
Yeah, these would turn into flying buttresses. So this type of buttress and the flying buttress are basically the same thing. It's just that they take the mass and they penetrate it so that it looks like it's more of a skeletal buttress, but it's the same idea.
Right. And so these supports, I mean, the idea is basically a little like you said before, right? The weight is sort of supposed to come down in the traditional architecture shape, and the form on the side is sort of additional, lateral, I guess, sort of diagonal support.
Yeah, it's preventing the walls from going like this and collapsing. because the roof isn't really going to provide, I mean, it will provide some support for that, but the roof can also equally just go like this, right? If it, the walls could go like that, the roof goes like this, and the whole thing collapses, right? So you need something to keep it in place, and that's what the buttresses are doing. And this roof is fantastic the way it goes beyond the walls like an umbrella, and it's probably for that reason to protect all the exterior painting. And there's one interesting aspect of this in the architecture pieces that we're going to look at. Voronet, Seville, and the Taj Mahal, the three of them are highly figured on the exterior. Why is that? Why did we feel the need to have our buildings not just be eloquent and full of paintings and sculpture and things on the inside, but also on the outside of the building? I don't know, but it is interesting that that tradition is not just happening here in Voronet or in France, in the Gothic churches in France, but it happens also in the Islamic tradition. Anyway, let's go to the next. Now, obviously, in the Islamic tradition, you're not supposed to depict the people or animals or any anthropomorphic forms, which we're free to do in the West. Right? So, yeah, this shows a little bit of the on the right side. You can see in between the trees the triapsidal form that you have around the apse of the church, and the center part where the mass would happen right underneath that part. Let's see. Let's go to the next. Right, you see people. This slide also shows you a little bit, perhaps better, the difference between the left-hand side of that wall and the right-hand side of that wall. And okay, let's go to the next. Right. Yeah, that's a closer up picture of that area. You can tell that also the piers had some painting that perhaps because it comes further out and it's not as protected by the roof above, so the sun and the water hit it and began to discolor it. So you can clearly see how the roof protects the painting.
Do you know what the medium was, the paint?
No, I'm curious about that, how they came up with that beautiful blue. And I assume the gold is gold, but I'm not sure what they usually use, like for red, they use insects, and I'm not sure what people use for the blue in those days, but most of these pigments are taken from earth colors of some sort. Maybe flowers, maybe blue flowers, I'm not sure.
And you don't know if it was like an egg tempera or something like that?
No, I'm not sure what the medium is for this. Something to research.
One thing that comes to mind here is the blue along the Gothic lines evokes for me the effect of stained glass. When you're in the Gothic church and the light is coming in through the windows with the overwhelmingly dark blue
right
background, there's a certain kind of warmth to that blue, which at least on my subjective level, I react to that a little. It creates more tranquility and ease of breath than, say, like the strong red that we saw in the previous example. I kind of feel more at ease and relaxed with large amounts of this blue.
Yeah, I think the blue does have that effect, right? And as opposed to the Chinese, which was more imposing because it was more about imposing authority. And yeah, you're supposed to feel a little uneasiness when you're in front of the emperor. Here, this is more about prayer, right? The whole point is that you approach this place as a place of prayer, and you have a different relationship with the emperor in here, which arguably is Jesus Christ, who is not about, well, yes, he is about power, but he is not only about power, because he is also about love, right? So, and that's the beauty of being able to pray about these things. And as you correctly said, the blue is conducive to that. Right? The gold is about power and majesty, and the blue is about, shall we say, heavenly repose, perhaps, where you can actually pray about God's majesty and power and be thankful for it because he's our savior, right? So
interiority maybe is an aspect.
right. And it's interesting because, as you say that, because in some of the pictures in here where we show the interiors, you have both. You have the blue and you have a lot of the gold. It's a typical Byzantine scheme of colors, because the icons that they have show that. There's a lot of, I have an icon here. There is always this idea of, right, of the gold used in some areas. You can see here. And in here. So this is the way the Byzantines, I mean, they had a whole, there's a icon painting schools that you go to, because icons are painted in a particular way. This icon is always the same. It's never going to be different. And you have to learn how to paint it like this, right? So, and perhaps Voronet, the Church of Voronet is about that. It's precisely, it's basically icon painting on the exterior of the church, which is what's so cool about it. I mean, very different from the Taj Mahal, because they would never do that because they were not allowed. Shall we go to the next one? Yeah, see, you see in there, it's basically arguably a whole slew of icons all put together in rows up the walls and up the roof. I mean, it is overwhelming when you look at that, but it is, perhaps it is the relationship between the outside and the inside. On the outside, you have the pilgrimage into heaven, and when you go inside, here inside, you are arguably in a representation of heaven with basically a number of saints all around you, right? So there's a lot more gold in here, though there is also blue, because you're surrounded by saints.
I'm struck at the continuity. I mean, obviously, like you said, there's differences between the inside and outside, but it's really like it's the theme continues of just almost overwhelming you with these scenes of different saints.
Right. Yeah, you're meant to feel like you're in good company, or in awesome company, literally, or that you want to eventually be counted in that company. So yeah, there's another one, I think, on the inside. Oh, there you go. This is, oh yeah, there you go. That's the inside. This is interesting because you can see the blue up there at the top of the dome, and that may be also because of the way the light is hitting it. And you can see the way it's built. It's Byzantine, yes. This is the way the Byzantines used to build, but it's also partially Gothic in that it begins to try to make the structure lighter. It's trying to make the structure of the whole thing lighter by relieving the stresses of the loads with all these arches superimposed. And as you go up, you have a circle and then more arches and another circle and until you get the cupola up on top, right? And then if you go to the, I'm sorry, go to the slide because this in here shows that the what do you call it? The apsidal forms from the inside, and the slide before shows the apsidal forms from the outside, which is so cool. And you do get also some relieving buttresses in here, which also used to be painted on their outside and shows that the painting is wearing off because it's outside, directly outside of the covering, of the roof covering above.
I'm struck here too that the more so on the far end of the roof here, but it has a similar sloping roof as in the Chinese example.
Yes, that may be, as I said, that may be simply, we do that also with some of our roofs in here. It may be simply to try to get the water as far away from the building as possible so that you don't have it, you know, if it's like this and it goes straight down, it's going to be splashing directly directly below the eave. And maybe that's what they want to do is to avoid that so that you don't have water splashing at the lower part and messing up the painting. Though the painting, you can tell it doesn't start until a certain datum, probably about 4 feet above the ground. Probably for that reason, to avoid the splashing water as it falls from messing it up.
Back here on the interior, you were talking a little bit about, you know, the Gothic structure of weight relief and so forth. Go a little further. I know this is the shapes here are very Byzantine, and you know, maybe if you go to the Hagia Sophia, you see a similar you know, sort of circular pattern as a means of allowing such a wide space to support so much roof about it. But the circular aspect isn't as Gothic, right? That's a little more Byzantine.
Yes. Let me see. It is. Well, I think what happens in here is that you have this strange combination, and maybe it's the function of it being the Byzantine. When you walk into a Byzantine church, even today, one of the things that strikes you is that there's so much iconography everywhere that sometimes it's hard to rest your eye. But in here, they have taken it to, I think, to a huge extreme. I mean, you have iconography. There's no a single surface that I can tell by looking at this picture that doesn't have something going on it. And that to some degree, see, the Gothic, somebody described Gothic architecture as a collection of heavenly mansions. In fact, there's a book, I think the author is John Summerson. I could be wrong on the name of the author, but it's called Heavenly Mansions. And that's what Gothic is. It's a bunch of ediculas, of little houses that go up the wall and they make up the church that way. And that's what you have here, interestingly enough. It's just that in a Gothic church, they tend to be more organized and vertical, whereas in these type of Byzantine early Christian churches, well, and this we consider early Christian being in 1488, but still it comes from that, right? They don't emphasize as much the verticality, but in Voronet in particular, you do have the emphasis again of the verticality because it's a more compressed. It's not like Hagia Sophia. Hagia Sophia tends to be wide and expansive. Voronet is compressed, and you're looking straight up in here. So you have that feeling of Gothicism, but it's not Gothic. It's just the sense of verticality that you get in Gothic church. And you don't have as much, you don't have any, what do you call it, stained glass in here. But the way the walls are painted, it more than makes up for the stained glass of any Gothic church that I have seen. Right? And that, yeah, that shows what they call the exonarthex to the left, which is where you have entrances on both sides. All the way to the left actually shows the piers going out, and that's where the final judgment scene is. And then you go into the narthex, and then you go into the naos of the church, which is where the ceremony is actually performed. And in fact, from my understanding of Byzantine or Orthodox rites, the people are not supposed to go into the naos. Only the priests are there, because you're looking at everything through I forget the name of that piece, but there is an iconostat, I think it's called. So you can't
Iconostasis.
You can't go through that. So in this case, it seems, I could be wrong, but it seems that the iconostasis is quite imposing, made out of masonry. But then again, I'm speculating because I haven't been to Voronet. Yeah. Have you been? Have you been there?
No.
I'd like to go.
So I think that's the last slide for this one. So we've hit the hour mark here. So why don't we, for today, let's take a break. This has been this has been huge and very interesting. And just for our viewers, we were intending to get through about 7 examples here, and we've made it through 2 in the in the hour. So I think we'll have to pause and bring the next installment at a future date. But Manuel, thanks so much. This was very cool, very interesting for me.
Good, wonderful. I'm happy to do this. Let's do it again.
So to be continued.
Yes, indeed.